For many years, the sky was my ceiling, and the cold stone steps of St. Anthony's Church in Boston were my shelter. The war had ended decades ago, but inside me, it never truly stopped. I didn't beg. I didn't speak much. I just stayed there, wrapped in an old army blanket with a satchel full of memories and one letter I wrote back in 1944, a letter I never had the courage to send. People passed by me every day. Some looked away, others offered coins or coffee. But I wasn't asking for anything. I wasn't waiting for kindness. I was just trying to disappear, slowly, silently. Father Thomas walked past me every morning. We rarely spoke. Sometimes he'd leave a warm bowl of soup beside me. Other times he'd nod gently, like he somehow understood the language of silence. That kind of understanding is rare. I always sat on the same side of the church, near the garden wall where the roses grew wild. Buried beneath those roses was a rusted tin box. Inside it, protected in layers of plastic and cloth, was a letter I wrote to Evelyn, my fiancée. I wrote it while recovering from a shrapnel wound in a makeshift military ward in France. I was 21. I promised her I'd come home, that we'd start a new life, that love would survive the war, but I never made it back to her. When I was discharged from the military hospital, I found nothing. No house, no family. The address was gone, the neighbors were gone. And Evelyn, no one knew. Some said she moved, others said she married someone else. One man told me she didn't survive the draft riots in Detroit. I stopped looking, not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't take another dead end. So I buried the letter, and with it, the last piece of myself. Then, one winter morning, Father Thomas knelt beside me. In his hands, he held that letter, old, weathered, still intact. He'd found the box while planting new roses. He looked at me with a kind of reverence I hadn't seen in years, and he whispered, "This story doesn't belong in the ground." That's when everything began to change. That's when the silence inside me started to break. If this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, give it a like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. My name is Henry Whitaker. It's an ordinary name, the kind that blends in, that doesn't raise eyebrows. But to me, it always felt like a scar, like something left over from a version of myself that got lost somewhere between Normandy and a Detroit train station. I was born in 1923 in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Detroit. My father worked the Ford assembly line. My mother kept the house and said the rosary every evening after dinner. We weren't rich, but we had structure. We had warmth. And then came the war. I enlisted the day after my older brother David was killed in the Pacific. I didn't ask questions. I just walked into the recruitment office, signed the papers, and became Private Whitaker, another boy with a uniform, a rifle, and more anger than answers. Before I left, I met Evelyn Mathers at a Sunday church picnic. She had honey-colored hair, a sharp wit, and a patience I didn't deserve. We fell in love fast, like the world was about to end. And maybe, in a way, it was. I asked her to marry me 2 weeks before I shipped out. She said yes, gave me a photo and a St. Christopher medal. I gave her a promise. I'd come back. They sent me to Europe. I was part of the 3rd Armored Division. I saw things I still can't talk about. Things that changed me in ways no sermon or psychiatrist has ever been able to undo. I remember one night in Belgium, lying in a barn with shrapnel in my leg, rats crawling through the straw, trying to write Evelyn a letter while holding a pencil between 2 fingers so stiff with pain they barely moved. That's the letter, the one Father Thomas found. I wrote it thinking I wouldn't survive. I told her how scared I was, how much I wanted a future. Not medals, not parades, just her. I told her about a tiny ring I'd twisted together from a wire I found in the rubble of a French village. "I'll give you this when I'm home," I wrote. "It's all I've got." But when I came back, there was no home. Detroit had changed. Our old house had burned down in a riot. My parents were gone. My mother had died while I was still in Europe. My father had a stroke and passed not long after. Evelyn Street was empty. Her neighbors didn't know where she'd gone. Someone said she'd moved out west. Someone else said she married a Navy man. I looked for her for a while, wrote letters, knocked on doors, but eventually I stopped. I couldn't take the weight of one more I don't know. That's when Henry Whitaker started to disappear. I stopped saying my name. I introduced myself as Hank when I needed to. Sometimes I said nothing at all. I wandered the Midwest, picking up odd jobs, welding, loading freight, fixing fences. I drank more than I should have. I started sleeping in alleys, then under bridges, then nowhere at all. The only constant I had was that letter and the ring. I kept them both with me for decades, wrapped in plastic inside an old Prince Albert tobacco tin. That tin became more sacred to me than any Bible. I didn't pray anymore, but I carried that box like it was the last piece of my soul. Eventually, I ended up in Boston. I don't even remember how I got here. Just a long train ride and too many missed stops. I found myself in the North End, drawn by the bells of St. Anthony's. Something about that church, its red brick walls, its wooden doors, the smell of candle wax drifting out onto the sidewalk, made me stop, made me sit. And once I sat, I never really left. I wasn't the only one. Boston has its fair share of ghosts still walking around in skin. But I stayed longer than most. Years, winters, whole presidencies. I watched the seasons change from those steps. Watched families go in and out. Watched children grow. Some of them even waved to me after a while. But I never told anyone who I was. Never said Henry Whitaker. That name hurt too much. It reminded me of who I was before everything fell apart. Of who I might have become if the world hadn't cracked wide open in 1944. Sometimes I wondered if Evelyn ever thought of me, if she hated me for disappearing, if she believed I had died, or worse, if she never really loved me at all, and I was just a passing shadow from a war-torn year she wanted to forget. But then Father Thomas found the letter, and everything I had buried, all those years ago under dirt and silence and shame, started to surface. After Detroit, I didn't really live anywhere. Not in any way that counts. I drifted across the country like a loose page in the wind, hitching rides, picking up work where I could, sleeping in freight yards and cheap motels when I had enough cash, and under highway overpasses when I didn't. I kept moving, not because I was looking for something, but because standing still meant remembering. And I wasn't strong enough for that. Every city had a different version of me. In Pittsburgh, I was a welder. In Omaha, a handyman. In Denver, I shoveled snow for cash and tried not to think about what day it was. I changed names when I needed to. Hank, Whit, Mac, whatever sounded like someone you'd forget after a handshake, but I always carried the box. That little tin container, rusty and dented from time, held everything I was afraid to face. The letter I wrote to Evelyn. The ring I made for her. A folded snapshot from 1943 where we stood outside her parents' house, laughing at nothing in particular. I kept it buried deep in my bag, wrapped in plastic, sealed in silence. Some men carry weapons or medals from the war. I carried a ghost. Eventually, I found myself in Boston. I was older by then, slower. My knees hurt. My back ached from years of sleeping on concrete. I stopped near St. Anthony's Church on Endicott Street because something about it made me pause. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the sound of the bells or the way the wooden doors looked like they belonged to another century. But I sat on the steps, just to rest my legs. And then I never left. I made that spot mine. I slept there, right under the portico. Rain or snow, summer heat or winter freeze, that was my shelter. I didn't go inside. I wasn't sure I was welcome. Or maybe I didn't feel worthy. But I listened. To the sermons through the doors, to the choir's echo during weddings and holidays, to the quiet shuffle of shoes on Sunday mornings. Those sounds became my rhythm. Father Thomas noticed me early on. Young guy, maybe early 40s, too young to understand war the way I did, but he had something in his eyes that told me he knew about loss. Not from combat, from life. He never asked me for anything, never asked my name, but he brought me food, water, fresh socks, left them beside me without a word. On really cold nights, he'd give me one of those thermal blankets that looked like foil. Once, he left a book of Psalms wrapped in a sandwich bag. I didn't read it, but I kept it anyway. There was a moment, a spring morning, must have been Easter season, when he sat next to me, just sat. We didn't speak for an hour, just listened to the birds and the bells. Then he said something I still remember. You know, this church has been here since the 1800s. It's seen immigrants, riots, baptisms, weddings, funerals. It's outlived everyone who ever built it. I didn't answer. But I thought about that, about how a building could endure so much and still stand. Meanwhile, I felt like one strong wind could take me out. One day, I took the tin box, the one with the letter and the ring, and buried it in the flower bed beside the church steps, under the edge of a rose bush. I dug the hole with a piece of rebar I'd found in the alley, covered it with soil, packed it tight. I don't know why I did it. Maybe because I couldn't carry it anymore. Maybe because I didn't want to die with it in my bag. Or maybe I just hoped that one day someone might find it and know that I had existed, that I had once loved, that I hadn't always been a shadow. After that, I stopped thinking about the past, at least on purpose. I stopped wondering about Evelyn, about Detroit, about who I might have been. It was easier that way. The days blurred together. Time became something other people lived by. I measured life in church bells and weather changes. People came and went. Some handed me change. Others pretended I wasn't there. A few kids left drawings. One girl brought me a sandwich every Friday, peanut butter and jelly, always the same. But I stayed, quiet, still, waiting maybe, but for what? I didn't know until that morning. Father Thomas had been planting new flowers, roses again. I was half asleep on the steps when I heard him shout, not in alarm, but in awe, "Hank!" I looked up. He was kneeling in the flower bed, holding the tin box in both hands like it was some kind of relic. Dirt under his nails, eyes wide. I knew the moment I saw it that the silence I'd lived in for 50 years was over. He didn't open it right away. He looked at me, not with judgment, but with something like reverence. Then he said softly, "This isn't garbage. This is someone's story." I nodded, my throat tightened. For the first time in decades, I wanted to speak. We waited until after the evening bells had rung and the last of the parishioners had gone home. Just me and Father Thomas, sitting side by side on the steps of St. Anthony's, like we had so many times before. Only this time, everything was different. The tin box sat in his lap, the one I'd buried years ago beneath the rose bushes, thinking it would stay hidden forever, thinking maybe that part of me didn't deserve to be unearthed. But there it was, the dented lid still intact, the plastic wrapping still clinging to it after all this time, as if some small mercy had protected it through every storm and every harsh Boston winter I'd spent sleeping inches away from it. He looked at me, his hands gentle but steady, and asked if he could read the letter. I didn't speak. I simply nodded, because my voice had been quiet for too long, and the moment already carried more weight than words could bear. He peeled back the layers slowly, reverently, like a priest handling relics from another life, which, in truth, he was. And when he unfolded the fragile page, I could see my own handwriting staring back at me, faded but still there, defiant against time. Then he began to read. "Evelyn, if this letter has reached you, it means I survived long enough to write it, maybe long enough for someone else to find it and carry it to you if I couldn't." His voice wasn't theatrical. It was soft, almost prayerful, the way someone might read from a psalm at a bedside, with compassion but also with restraint, like he knew each word he spoke carried 1,000 more I had never said aloud. "I'm somewhere in France. The cold is biting, and my leg's not holding up well, but I'm alive. For now. I don't know if I'll make it home. I don't know if I'll ever see your face again, but every minute I hang on feels like it's because of you." The sound of his voice stirred something in me. Not grief exactly, but memory. Strange kind of memory that doesn't show you images, but feelings. The scent of Evelyn's hair, the curve of her laugh, the way she used to rest her head against my chest like the world couldn't touch her there. I remember the way you looked that Sunday, in the yellow dress, your smile full of sunlight, like you weren't afraid of anything, like you believed I'd come home no matter what. I want to believe it too. By now my throat was tight, and my hands were trembling in my lap. I hadn't cried in years, hadn't allowed myself to, but tears sat heavy in my chest like smoke with no fire, waiting for something to crack the dam. I made you a ring from copper wire I found in a crumbled wall. It's crude, I know, but I twisted it with my own hands, and it held. That's all I want for us, to be something rough and real and unbreakable. If I come back, I'll put it on your finger. If I don't, just know that you were the one thing I got right." Father Thomas paused after that line. He didn't need to, the words were clear, but I think he needed a breath, and maybe I did too. Because hearing them again, in someone else's voice, on someone else's breath, made them feel more real than they had ever been, even when I first wrote them. When he finished the letter, he folded it gently and placed it back in the box without a word. We sat there in silence, the night falling around us like a blanket, the street quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. For a while, it was just the sound of my breathing and the slow, rhythmic beat of my heart, a sound I'd long forgotten to pay attention to. Then, Father Thomas turned to me and said, with a gravity I wasn't prepared for but somehow needed to hear, "She deserved to know you survived." And in that one sentence, not a sermon, not a judgment, just a truth, something inside me crumbled. Because he was right. All these years, I'd convinced myself that burying the past was a form of healing, that forgetting was a kind of mercy, but deep down, I knew I hadn't buried it out of peace. I had buried it out of fear. Fear that Evelyn had moved on. Fear that I no longer belonged in the world she might have built without me. Fear that my silence had been too loud to forgive. But Father Thomas didn't ask for explanations. He simply asked for permission to try, to look through parish records, military databases, Red Cross archives, anything that might give us a trace of her. And for once, I didn't say no. Weeks passed. He made calls, sent letters, traveled across the city to meet with people whose names I never knew. And then, one evening, he returned, holding a folder that looked almost too light to carry the weight I'd given it. He sat beside me, just like always, and opened it slowly. "Her name was Evelyn Mathers Whitaker," he said. "She never married anyone else. She legally added your name to hers in 1947. That hit me like a hammer. Whitaker. My name. Still hers. She lived in California, passed away in 1995, but before she died, she left a letter at her parish. It was addressed to Henry, if he still exists." He handed me a copy. "Henry, if you're reading this, I want you to know I never stopped loving you. I searched for you. I prayed for you. And even when hope ran dry, I still waited. If you're alive and this ever finds you, you were my forever." I don't remember crying, but I remember the release, the way my shoulders slumped, the way my chest opened, the way a lifetime of silence finally breathed out of me. Because in that moment, I realized I had not been lost. I had simply been waiting to be found. When I first read her words, written in a steadier hand than mine had ever been, I understood that everything, every moment of waiting, every trembling thought had led me to this point. And when Father Thomas told me that Evelyn had passed away in California in 1995, his voice soft but firm, I felt a strange swelling of peace mixed with the ache of regret, like an old wound finally acknowledged. He'd handed me the folder gently, as though it contained something sacred, and I held it like a fragile lifeline. tracing the edges with fingers that had forgotten how to tremble until I read her letter that began with, "To Henry, if you still exist," and continued to confess a love that had never waned, that had echoed across decades of silence and distance, always waiting, always hoping. I closed my eyes after that, and for what felt like an eternity, all I could hear was my own broken heart breathing, a heart that had given up on hope, but never altogether on love. And when I dared to open them again, the world looked different, softer somehow, as if she had touched it through that letter and changed it. Father Thomas looked at me with quiet understanding, not pity, because he saw me, the lost veteran who had forgotten how to be seen, and he stepped closer, offering what no one had in years, a half-hopeful question. "Would you like to meet someone who knew her best?" I nodded, though my throat was tight and a smile felt forbidden. But then I looked down at the photograph he handed me just then, of a woman who bore Evelyn's eyes, gentle, warm, still vivid, holding a small girl that must have been her niece, and it felt like she was reaching out across time to welcome me back. We booked a flight west. I'd crossed borders before under different names, different days, but never like this, with purpose, with trembling anticipation, with a small spark lighting up inside me that I thought had been extinguished. The plane landed in San Mateo, and when I stepped out into the steady California sun, warm air brushing against the light jacket I'd worn for years, as Father Thomas guided me through quiet streets lined with eucalyptus and palm, I felt the weight of every year I'd carried fall from my shoulders. We arrived at a modest home draped with climbing roses, and the door opened to reveal the niece, a woman in late middle age, kind-eyed and tentative. And when she saw me, she simply whispered, "Are you Henry?" A voice broke something inside me. Years of distance cracked open, and I stepped forward, lifting trembling hands to greet her like one might step onto a bridge they thought had collapsed long ago. We spent hours in that living room that felt like catching up on decades in moments, and she brought out photos of Evelyn through the years, standing beside a Christmas tree, teaching Sunday school, writing letters, even as the young woman I remembered grew into someone more complex, shaped by a life apart from mine, but never forgetting the promise I once held. On the last day, when I knelt at Aunt Evelyn's grave in the local Catholic cemetery, her headstone bearing her name and the date of her passing, I whispered, almost to myself, "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I'm sorry I didn't try harder, but I never forgot." The breeze whispered through the pines overhead, carrying the quiet memory of someone I still loved. When I returned to Boston, carrying a small box of mementos, family photos, my name on their walls, my story no longer silent, Father Thomas waited under the glow of the church's porch light with a fresh cup of tea, and I took it, shaking. And then we sat together in the darkened stillness of the church steps, and he simply said, "Sometimes it takes one letter to bring someone all the way home." I nodded, thinking of Evelyn, thinking of the letter, thinking of a man who always believed he was lost until love found its way back to him. Today, I no longer sleep on the church steps, though some mornings I still wake before the bells, as if my body remembers the years I spent out there beneath the sky, listening to the world forget me. My bed now is small, tucked in the back room of the rectory at St. Anthony's, the room Father Thomas quietly prepared for me without ever asking for anything in return, just offering it with the kind of quiet dignity that says, "You deserve a place." The walls are bare, save for two frames that sit above my dresser, one containing the letter I wrote to Evelyn in 1944, yellowed and carefully mounted behind glass, and the other, the letter she left for me, written nearly 30 years later, still so full of grace, it feels like a prayer. Sometimes I read them both back to back, and I wonder how many lives are held in the space between two letters, how many wars, how many silences, how many what-ifs. I didn't get to see her again. I didn't get to grow old beside her, or hear her laugh in the kitchen, or feel the warmth of her hand reaching for mine on quiet Sunday mornings. But I know now, I know deeply that love doesn't disappear just because time passes. It waits, it holds, it carries you, even when you've stopped believing you're worthy of being carried. And never remarried. She never gave up on me. And in her niece's eyes, in the story she told, I saw the kind of life Evelyn built from hope, not from bitterness, not from loss, but from love that refused to vanish. Now, in the mornings, I sit outside the church with a coffee in hand, watching the people walk past the very place I used to lie unnoticed, and some of them smile now, some nod, some even stop to talk, not out of pity, but out of recognition. They know me as Mr. Henry, the old man who keeps to himself, but always has time for a kind word or a story. And I do have stories, not just of war and pain, but of love, of waiting, of second chances that sometimes come dressed as letters in the dirt. I'm not trying to be remembered anymore. That's not what this is. I'm just trying to leave something true behind. Because if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the heart, even after decades in the dark, still knows how to find its way back to the light, especially when someone's still out there holding it in their prayers. My name is Henry Whitaker. I was a soldier, a man who waited too long to forgive himself, a man who loved and was loved in return. And if there's anything I can tell you, if you're still listening, it's this. Sometimes the world doesn't give you a grand ending or a perfect reunion. Sometimes it gives you a quiet room, a letter that survived the war, and the chance, however late, to whisper thank you to someone who never stopped believing in you. And that, I think, is enough. We share new stories every day. Real stories, full of hope, heartbreak, and the quiet power of love. If this one moved you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because you never know which story might change your life.